All right, everyone. Hello and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. I'm recording this video on the 24th of June. Tomorrow, we're having a new moon in Cancer. I have to admit that the last week or so has been somewhat hectic in regards to world events and unfolding drama at the global political stage. And when it comes to astrology, this is something about, I think, really a good example of the fact that so we're going through some pretty major transits here, and we can see that, like it or not, astrology works. And I think there's something to be said for taking a stoic approach to what's going on. Although I have to also admit that stoicism usually is considered to be something that is, I don't know, equated with these kinds of like unemotional or this kind of like tough masculinity over the sensitive, kind of sensitive, intuitive faculty. And based on that kind of dynamic, I think there's something you can kind of see about this dynamic with the new moon, because you basically have Jupiter in Cancer. And there's a certain, when you think about like sensitivity, you think about like the sense, like a feminine coded sensitivity of women being sensitive to babies or something like that, in contrast to the Senex, which is like kind of like a crusty old man or something, right? Who's kind of, or like the idea of having, you could use the temperamental characteristics of the planet in terms of a kind of a wetness or a kind of a dryness, right? And there's something that kind of like, think about like Cancer, the peak of the summer. There's a lot of, all the plants are at the point where they're growing the most. There's a lot of foliage. There's a lot of stuff growing. So there is that kind of Jupiter growing kind of dynamic with fertility and stuff like that. But there's also a kind of an arid dryness as a kind of a shadow cast over the whole dynamic, unfortunately, with Saturn and Neptune in a square to the new moon. And one of the things about this is, I think it's also important to consider the when you think about the traditional dignities of these planets, we have a condition known as exaltation and fall. And exaltation and fall are different from the dignities of the domicile and exile. Domicile and exile is said to be is kind of like your home base versus being in enemy territory or in a foreign, unfamiliar environment that's not suited to your needs. Whereas exaltation and fall is sort of meant to mean being raised up on high versus having fallen into some kind of pit, kind of fallen into some kind of problem that's not good for you or whatever, right? And the thing about this is, like, the dynamic of exaltation and fall represents things which could be considered like kind of maybe jaggedly uneven or spiky. There could be some opportunity to get lucky, but then only to experience the vicissitudes and vagaries of fortune. You know what I'm saying? Like the thing, easy come, easy go, or there being huge ups and downs to what's going on, right? And with all this in mind, it's also important to consider that Saturn and Neptune are in the overcoming square to Jupiter in Cancer in the new moon. but Jupiter in Cancer in the new moon, in the dignity of exaltation, provide a degree of protection from the negative dynamic of Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which is described, I'm just really describing as negative because Saturn here is in its fall. Saturn is not in a position to have really a good time in this position. And there's something also I feel somewhat contradictory about, well, a Saturn-Neptune is what it is, but there's something about Neptune and Saturn that I feel is playing out in a way that's very literal, concrete in the political sphere when it comes to issues such as boundary issues, right? Having, or nationalism, or isolationism, right? There's this kind of idea of wanting to create a strong, isolated national boundary, but then having being in a weak position to do this, and being kind of if you're trying to do this, it becomes kind of wishy-washy and inconsistent, and doesn't work out very well. Or this was also basically used in a way to explain the problematic archetype with the communists, because basically the idea here is that you know what's actually funny, I was listening to, like, some people, there might be a kind of confusion around whether or not something like communism and capitalism is coded as masculine or feminine, right? Because something about all this, both of these principles are seen as progress away from the old order of, let's say, a monarchy or feudalism or whatever, right? And you've got astrology coming out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where there is a kind of a slide from democracy into empire, and capitalism is something that's fairly new, in the sense that it's only after the advent of the Dutch East India Trading Company and a certain technique of profiting and over the lending of money to fund foreign exports, basically, right? I'm not going to get into the complicated stuff about that, but there's something about, because capitalism involves you and your merry men on your little trading boats going over to India to get, tea and spices and things like that to sell to these, white ass European people who have no idea of what exotic flavors are like, so they're easily impressed by this stuff, right? Like, that's the basic principle of capitalism in that sense, means that it involves a diversity of cultures, right? And particularly a diversity of cultures from which to profit from, right? And in the sense that, the archetypal male is a kind of a singular force who has a will to, a drive to individuate, a drive to, like, stand on their own 2 feet, a drive to be kind of singular in the world. There's something inherently archetypally feminine, I would argue, about the diversity and multiplicity of the having trade with multiple foreign nations, in the sense that it's sort of like a mother who has multiple children that she ends up getting into there's sort of thing, if you can read between the lines of what's going on with the tariffs, right? You've got this whole dynamic where it's like the Americans want a strong father figure the authoritarian father figure, because they have seen their trading partners as if they are sort of like needy, dependent children who are now dependently asking for favors from daddy United States, and we need a more kind of stricter, austere kind of regime as like a strict parent figure or something like that, right? If you can understand that dynamic. But so there's this kind of the whole issue with this capitalism here. What I'm trying to say is that it's interesting for me to try to watch some other New Agers do videos about capitalism versus communism, or capitalism versus because what they'll do is they'll associate communism as this sort of feminine, motherly influence to like take care, like be overly caregiving, like all the poor and the needy, it's our motherly job to self-sacrifice our wealth and our privilege so that we can look after all the poor needy people in the street, rather than the heroic masculine striving for self-aggrandizement, right? But there's this kind of idea that like in this need to save and rescue the poor, we end up being like the toxic mother who gives too much, and then it creates a moralism that's basically just a kind of a guilt trip, right? That or there's a or doesn't understand what the boundaries are, right? Like overextends, takes a certain situation, is overly idealistic about it, doesn't have no idea about boundaries, overextends the boundaries, and then you're left like in the breadline, basically, right? And then in contrast to this, capitalism is usually associated as masculinity, being like the person who, instead of being, is going to be strict with his, instead of capitalism being like, there's some other country that has a bunch of stuff that we don't have, such as, let's say, tea and oranges and lemons that we can't grow, or like bananas and mangoes, avocados, things that we can't grow in our own country. And because of the fact that there's this inherent limitation to the geography, we are overcoming that and becoming a more abundant and plentiful society by creating favorable trading relations with our friends and neighbors and over other places. There's this kind of idea that capitalism is actually all about a man who is in a role of patriarchal dominance, who gets to set the rules in some kind of arbitrary way and just say that is the nature of the market forces. When really, I think it's an argument to be made, it's actually completely opposite, right? That there was, prior to capitalism, there was a patriarchally dominated monarchy kind of society, right? Which sometimes the queen was the had a position to be the most powerful figure, but there was this kind of rule of authority by some emperor or some kind of king that had some sort of absolute authority, that his rule was law, and that basically started to crack and crumble and give way under the pressures of capitalism and technology and all that kind of stuff, right? So I would argue that capitalism is actually more of a yin feminine principle, and that what seems to happen with the process of capitalism globally is that it creates certain dynamics where, because the United States wanted to give other countries an incentive to go in a more capitalistic direction as opposed to a communistic direction, they started to create incentives by keeping them under the umbrella of friendly American trade, and all this kind of stuff has been disrupted now by Donald Trump, apparently. But there's this idea that it was interesting, though, because it's surprisingly anti-capitalistic, right? There's some, and the but Donald Trump also presents himself as a businessman. There's a lot of different sort of contradictions, perhaps, with the whole thing. Is it like the but there's certain things to take into consideration, right? Because the Russian Revolution did happen under a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Saturn-Neptune has historically come to represent the force of communism and a force of kind of stubborn idealism to believe in an ideal, right? Like, you could also take in a different direction, like a kind of a mystical ideal that you're striving for, that we want to realize, that we want to concretize, to bring down into earth. But there's a kind of like the the concrete reality that we're dealing with, concrete material reality, is somehow in some kind of stubborn resistance to this sort of fantasy world of Neptune, right? There's a basic principle behind this that I feel is best represented by an author whom I have a small collection of his books. Philip K. Dick once said that you know reality because it's there's something about it, like the pinch me if I'm dreaming effect, right? Like if everything seems like it's too good to be true, chances are it's not real, right? There's always something inherently disappointing about reality, and I think with Saturn Neptune, there's a risk of trying to getting caught in the dream of the archetypal ideal, right? The image of striving to some kind of perfection. And a good example of this, I think you could look at Saturn and Jupiter when it comes to, oftentimes, like, Jupiter is a good indicator, a signifier for the presence of a teacher, right? The spirit of the teacher. And then there's a kind of disappointment that happens when our teachers do not really live up to some kind of ideal that we have of what a perfect teacher ought to be, right? So it's kind of disappointing. It's sort of like with Saturn in Aries, it's sort of like you expect, as maybe somebody gets older, a kind of a maturity, right? A sort of a wisdom that comes with age, a kind of like knowing when to say no, knowing when not to do things, right? But instead, there's a kind of a youthful immaturity with Aries, unfortunately, right? Where the teacher, who you expect to act like the ideal of the Senex, the mature, wise old man, is now acting like a immature child, cracking jokes and shooting spitballs, right? It's like, so there's another thing to watch out for. There's something about all this particular new moon, that I thought it would be a good idea to approach it in this kind of way, where I'm looking at the chart, because the moon is, when you talk about astrology, the moon is said to be the closest object to the Earth. And in fact, if you verify this by going out, you may notice that the moon is in fact a very large object close to Earth, right? So the way that the ancients used to think about this was that any of the cosmic energies, before the cosmic energies of the zodiac infiltrated our sublunar realm, they had to pass the membrane-like barrier of the moon, right? And in the sense of the new moon in Cancer, the emphasis is on this barrier as a kind of like eggshell, a fragile, sensitive eggshell that the energies of the outside world, it's like, when a lot of this whole thing comes from this idea that, like, when a child is born, it's taking in impressions at a very subliminal kind of level of what's going on in the environment, right? And so there may be this kind of thing where under, like, with a lot of stress going on, there may be this sort of like, some people may take to something like the dating apps or something like that to, like, sort of they want to get their rocks off or something like that. But then if somebody accidentally gets pregnant under such conditions, you have to consider what are the whole global unconscious stresses going into this dynamic, and there's all kinds of, like, what's going on in the environment during the pregnancy, and all this kind of stuff may go on to influence the child. And there's the astrologer of doing natal astrology saw astrology as a way to, like, see the what would be favorable conditions for that kind of thing and what wouldn't be. And here there's this kind of a mix, right? There's like pros and cons to do with the fact that Jupiter is exalted, but the fact that this Saturn and Neptune thing is in its fall and in a overcoming square, right? So it's a very, it's kind of like the seesaw. It's a very up and down seesaw kind of situation. So far, I've been focusing on these kind of dynamics because the Saturn and Neptune one has been the biggest one we've been dealing with this year. But there's some other important things I'd like to point out. If you can bear with me here, something interesting is that you notice that Venus and Uranus, Venus is approaching a conjunction with Uranus in Taurus, and Taurus is at the anaretic degree, meaning it's just about to ingress into Gemini. And this is particularly interesting because one thing that I've noticed as a amateur astrologer, I have to admit that I've only been doing this since around 2017, and as such, I don't take any. One of the things about Jupiter you need to consider is that Jupiter, unfortunately, sometimes represents a certain sense of entitlement, right? A certain kind of Jupiter is in a good sign. Jupiter's lucky and abundant. What am I going to get from this kind of thing, right? And as a person who has a fairly strong Jupiter in my chart, there's something about that whole dynamic where it's better to just be humble and not expect too much from things and keep modest, right? But there is something about this dynamic with Jupiter of great expectations, expecting something big, right? And so there's something about where my attention keeps getting drawn to this and distracted away from other things, but there are other more subtle things to think about, such as Uranus moving into Gemini. What am I trying to say? The sublunar realm with this dynamic with Jupiter, a time of expectation, a time of perhaps sensitivity, perhaps this sort of fragile eggshell moment, but there's this sort of dry, arid dynamic that I think comes from a crisis of maturity, right? A world where our leaders resemble bumbling babies and idiots and buffoons, and there's a failure to take things seriously at the time when we really ought to be taking things seriously the most, right? They're at a time. I think one thing that we should emphasize here is that if it's possible at all that a World War III would break out, the last thing you want to do is joking around about it, right? The last thing anybody wants to do right now is joke about something like that, right? It's no joke, right? And so we need everybody to be on their most serious behavior, because to make up for the fact that the Saturn and Neptune in Aries is in its fall. We've got a crisis where the elders are like little babies, right? And that it's just the infant child in the womb is going to be detecting this and be detecting as being born into a world that it can no longer take seriously, because of the process of basically capitalist disintegration of old traditional norms, right? Or that's one particular way you could approach it. But now, some people talk about that problem in terms of what Carl Jung warned us about the age of Aquarius, right? But the thing is, the same people who put a lot of emphasis on the age of Aquarius don't tend to take the age of Aquarius seriously enough to time it up and look at when it's actually supposed to happen. Instead, they just kind of use this idea, like in Carl Jung's book Aion, he says, oh, it could have started as early as 1997. These people tend to be types, maybe what you would describe as neckbeardy anime nerds, and when they find out that the age of Aquarius started at when all the good anime was coming out, that sounds good enough to them, so they just roll with it, right? So there's this kind of thing going on where people are expecting basically a, like the sort of Christian millenarian end of the world thing where there's all this pressure because we have such a crisis in our leadership, such a crisis in the the image of what healthy gender norms or healthy or what masculinity is supposed to mean. We now have a bunch of like neck bearded samurai nerds trying to create this image of the archetypal father, and basically they don't realize how whack it is, or they don't realize how they're kind of captured. They're what they think is striving towards some kind of ideal is actually a kind of projection or of immaturity or something like that. Or there's something about the condition that your attempt to like have a mature, disciplined, like the kind of thing is like if you try to come off as being more mature and serious and disciplined than you really are, it's going to show, right? People are going to tell when it's authentic and when it isn't, right? You're not going to fool anybody under a transit like this, let me tell you. But with that in mind, there's something about this which feels very much, I was kind of teasing this thing about Pluto. What we've got is shortly after this, we've got Mercury ingressing into Leo, making an opposition to that Pluto in Aquarius. And, I think the Pluto in Aquarius is really interesting in the sense that it often stands for the id, the shadow, some kind of repressed material. And I have to admit that as a person who's really interested in astrology, one of the things I love about doing this is it just gives me an opportunity to express myself perhaps in a way that maybe I wouldn't if I was just having a conversation with the people that I have every day face to face. It gives me this kind of opportunity to create a kind of a virtual space to do something I normally wouldn't, right? Now, if you think about what the water bearer is like, the water bearer is a man who is holding a container, right? First and foremost, it's a container. Does it hold water or does it not, right? Is there a hole in your bucket? If there's a hole in your bucket, dear Liza, I don't think you're going to be carrying much water in your Aquarian water jug, right? So there's certain kind of things around this dynamic where we're going to see is like, does your Aquarian bucket hold water? Okay. I was also talking about Uranus into Taurus, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a preview here. And like I was saying, when it comes to serious topics, there are no topics more serious than Christian millenarianism, the apocalypse, and the end of the world. So don't joke around about it. But if you're trying to try to figure out what's going to happen, I'm expecting something big to happen when Uranus enters the early degrees of Gemini, right? I'm expecting some big shit to go down. But if you notice, look at this, Venus and Uranus conjunct at 29 degrees on the 4th of July. Oh my God, I didn't even notice that was the 4th of July. Wow, I'm putting it together in real time for you here. We're going to have, this is one hell of an interesting 4th of July chart coming up. I'm kind of getting a bit ahead of myself. But what's going to happen after the 4th of July? Boom, Venus and Gemini. You got Venus, what does this resonate with? The dove, the peace. Now, I know in Vedic astrology, they use a sidereal chart. And I'm doing tropical astrology. But I think there's also something to consider about the archetype of the Taurus, even if you are tropical, in that Taurus being a Venusian sign. The Hindus had worshipped the cow as a holy animal, where they would not, there are a lot of people who are vegans or vegetarian. I'm not really vegan in India, but you know what I'm saying? They would worship the cow, the cow in the field, being like that. They'll keep the cow happy as a happy cow animal. And with Venus, a peaceful, tranquil kind of attitude. In times of such great, fear around, what could be going wrong with a Uranus into Gemini transit, I would say it's actually a refreshingly good omen that Venus and Uranus are going to be conjunct when this happens, right? And then they're going to be hitting this trine to Pluto and Aquarius, which is this sort of id factor, right? The shadow factor. There's some kind of thing about the destructive force of Pluto too, because one of the things about the id is that oftentimes what we value is to be positive and constructive, and the problem about Pluto is that we may have unsociable urges or unsociable sensibilities, right? That maybe because they're not socially acceptable, we can't express them, and so there's a risk here, I think, of the return of the repressed, right? And I think one of the things to consider about all this is that it's also going to be forming this trine, or the trine is also going to have the sextile to the Saturn and Neptune, and Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius. Your ability to hold water in your Aquarian water jug is kind of contingent upon the ability to keep a boundary between things which are expressed and things which are not expressed, but this boundary could be considered a boundary of privilege, a boundary that the repressed is like a kind of a prisoner or an exile, or there's some kind of shadow force that is omitted for the sake of keeping the container intact, right? Because this is the whole thing: is if the shadow force has a effect which is destructive, as in certain, like poking holes in something, if you have a hole in your bucket, then your bucket is going to leak water all over the place, right? And that at this early stage of Pluto and Aquarius, what we're looking for primarily is the ability to it's a fixed sign, right? So what's a fixed sign? You got a cardinal sign, you got a fixed sign, you got a mutable sign. The cardinal initiates something, the fixed sign conserves what was initiated, and then the mutable sign is a kind of transition or letting go of that, whatever it was, and a opening up to the next thing. So in the dynamic between this upcoming trine between Pluto and Uranus, what we're dealing with is a fixed this kind of like trying to take what has been established and prevent the leakage so we can carry the water into the future, basically, right? But what happens with Uranus is often described as a breakthrough, a shattering, a disruption. So there is whatever we have as our container could be subject to crack, a shattering moment, and one of the things that one of my videos that I was talking about, I mentioned the F. Scott Fitzgerald, the crack up, and there's certain things like crack up capitalism, for example, where there's certain things like, let's say, moving away from brick and mortar to Amazon warehouses, or moving away from taxi driving to Uber, or all those kinds of technological disruptions. I think one of the easy things to read here is there's going to be some more of that. But we have enough experience watching this play out that we want to shore up the things that we value in the face of the transit. The Gemini has more to do with change and transition, or the interplay of a variety of different forces, and whereas Aquarius wants to hold the water, the thing that it holds dear and is valuable to it, right? And then Saturn and Neptune are supposed to be the ability to imagine the future, right? Imagine where we're going with all this, but there's some kind of difficulty in that the ability to imagine the future is either too childish and naive or infantile, or else the two, basically with Saturn, it's like the elders have become kind of senile, and we can't rely on them to have an imagination anymore, because it's like it's people who, like, if you ask them what they want to have for dinner, it's like they can only think of one thing, and they if you try to, like, oh, do you want to try this? Oh, it's too, no, I can't think of that. Like, you know, it's like, or if you're like, it's like somebody who wants to just watch the same movie over and over and over again, and you're like, oh, well, there's some new thing, and they're just like, they can't, like, it's like the problem with Saturn and Aries, I think, is like this sort of like becoming so hard and crusty on one thing that if you try to introduce something new to it, they're just like, oh, I can't do that. I only like my one thing that I like, and then like it's kind of just like, oh my God, right? Can you please open up and be a bit more flexible? Can we please kind of like try to, it's like taking something that's really dry and crusty and wanting to like moisturize and exfoliate and try to just like can we shed some of the crusty old junk and like open up the space for some sort of fresh new vitality to come in? Would that be, does that sound like kind of pleasing, or was it just, do we want to just lock down really hard on, this is the only way I know how to do things, and I'm just gonna be like this for the rest of my life, and oh, I'm just some crusty old, you know, like, we don't want to do that, right? So like the best thing I think with this, but is to also, you know, the problem about, I think the Neptune, the best kind of thing about Neptune is that sometimes it can be like a spa date. So it's like we want to take the old and crusty Saturn to the spa and kind of rejuvenate it and put the cucumbers on its eyes and get it to sort of relax a bit. And I think there's also perhaps to consider, you've got Chiron in Aries still. You know, not in the conjunction, but still as an overall influence, there may be some sort of healing potential to sort of like slow down a bit, take it easy, take a break or something like that, and let something that's so rigid on just doing something in a very like stiff way to sort of like, you know, open up a bit, right? Like there's different options. Like you don't have to feel like your life is just stuck on this one rigid track where this is the only way you have to do things. That if you relax your kind of like hypervigilance about the world, because Saturn is all about boundaries, right? This thing that Saturn is, there's a sort of stands for there's a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, and Saturn is kind of like the old bad cop who's just used to saying no, who's used to denying people, who's used to being tough, who's used to just being like, you know, this is the only way we do things, and if you don't do it like that, you're just going to have to shut up and do something else, right? There's like that kind of like just rigidly inflexible thing, but it's starting to look a little bit ridiculous and childish in an atmosphere when there's certain things which are, you know, it's maybe even ignorant because it doesn't understand the water it's swimming in, right? It like it may have this kind of old-fashioned idea about what the norms are, and whereas there's a kind of like it's swimming in the waters of the mass consciousness, and the things that what it thinks is going to appeal to that environment is actually, you know, it may be time to sort of, rather than just rigidly fixate on this thing, to sort of like open up a little bit to some new ideas coming in, right? But the problem, there's kind of like the, you know, there's like, I think the idea here is that there can be there's this sort of energy that can feel kind of tense even, right? Or in its sort of like rigidity and fixedness, and that tension, you know, maybe it even thinks that tension is helpful because it views the world through the fascist imaginary, right? It sees that as like, oh, if I'm just be a strong authoritarian and I just be really rigid and tough and strict and this is the only way to do things, then that's my ideal of what a strong parental figure is like. And so that helps to restore my childlike yearning for daddy to just try to be like this, but it comes off as being kind of childish, right? So And what I think it's an exciting moment because with Uranus and Gemini, there's some disruptive potential for some new development where things are going to change. And I think it could be obvious. I mean, everybody is talking about AI and technology and all this kind of stuff. But I'm hoping, anyways, that there could be some kind of new thing that happens that allows us to. What I love about this is that we've got sextiles here, which are not as much tension as squares or oppositions. And I honestly think that it's like part of the problem that we're dealing with here is what I'm calling the fascist imaginary is also this, like, it's Christo fascist imaginary where the Christians were always obsessed with this like Christian millenarianism where it's always the goddamn end of the world. You know, how about we scale it back a little bit? Instead of it being about the apocalypse and the end of the world, why don't we just say it's like the end of like influencer culture, right? Because there's this thing like influencer culture was especially, you know, like think about it. Like when was Instagram, influencer culture basically started when Instagram got popular and the corporations were given the same legal status as human individuals. And then what you ended up seeing was that the corporation ended up becoming mixed in on the social media feed at a parity level of the human being. And you even had people, you know, on like corporations on Twitter posing as if they were people, right? Trying to make jokes as if they're your, like, this kind of thing as like the influencer there is basically the opposite effect where the individual person becomes a climate, as they acclimate to that kind of climate, they have to think of everything they do as if they are like a corporate stooge, basically. And I think that at least with one of the great things about astrology is that we can see a lot of this has to do with the fact that, you know, Neptune was in Pisces, and like at this point in time, like we're in this moment where that's starting to feel a bit old, is wearing a bit thin, and I think people are kind of like, you know, had enough with that bullshit. And I think that whatever is on the horizon with Uranus and Venus, you know, I think that there's an opportunity for hope, for optimism, in the sense that maybe change will bring us a new media environment where we don't have to just sit around complaining that everything we do is just turning us into these stupid social media influencers. There's like an opportunity for a new way to engage with the media, or some sort of shift around the predominance of podcasts. There's going to be some disruption in the area of podcasting. I was talking about in my other video. All right, I think this is pretty good. I'm already, as you can see, I mean, I guess I'll push it a bit further. You can see this is also going to be a full moon in Capricorn, which will be, you know, the moon, you know, this is also the whole thing about exaltations and falls and stuff like that. The moon is in its home in Cancer, but it's not in its home in Capricorn. And so there's something about, oftentimes this is sort of portrayed as the feminine dynamic of like the mother who is nurturing at home with the baby versus the masculine. Oh wait, Capricorn is also feminine. Oh, okay. So I guess you can't do that stupid gender binary bullshit on Capricorn being like the hardworking man versus the mother. It's actually two feminine signs, two yin signs, and Capricorn has to do with the dark earth, right? Or like the dark earth that comes at the end of winter, right? And it's like, it's interesting to see how, you know, we get tricked into this stupid yin yang bullshit and here we have this feminine dynamic for the full moon squared by Saturn and Neptune in, you know, being a little yangy baby about it rather than being mature. But we'll get more on that. I'm just, this is supposed to only just be for the new moon. Thanks for watching.